Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today I wanted to do a wrap up of all of the books that I read in March. It was an incredible reading month for me actually. I had such a great time. There were so many wonderful reads that I did. And I just want to share some of them with you. So some of these I read for a vlog that you should be seeing pretty soon. So excuse me for not talking about those a bunch, but I did talk about them very in depth in the vlog. So I'll just kind of briefly talk about them here. So I read 12 books in March and most of them were 5 stars. There was nothing below a 4-star, which was just amazing. So let's get into it. The books that I read for my vlog. I read 3 books for that. I was supposed to be reading a different book, but then I ended up DNFing it. Oh well. And I read Die My Love by Ariana Harwicks, as well as Feeble Minded by Ariana Harwicks. And I read Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So, talking about Die My Love, it was a very strange read, but I really loved getting inside this character's head. So it's about a woman who is a mother to a young child and has a husband, and they're kind of living in the middle of nowhere in the French countryside, and she just slowly descends into madness. It talks a lot about how her husband and her surrounding family members don't believe her when she says she has all of these problems, and they just kind of think that she is going haywire. They don't understand that she actually has mental illness that needs to be treated. It's written so beautifully. I think part of that is the translation. I think it was a really great translation, but most of the credit obviously goes to Ariana Harwicks herself. I don't know what this would be like in Spanish. I wish I knew Spanish so I could fully understand and read it in Spanish in its original intended language. But even this translation is just absolutely beautiful. And it's definitely not something to read for plot. It's definitely something to read for the language and for the literary merit. So for Feeble Minded, this one really talked a lot about mother-daughter relationships. So this follows a mother and daughter who the narrator is the daughter, and I believe she's unnamed. But it's about how they have this attachment to each other that they just cannot seem to break. And I think there's a lot of trauma associated with it also, because the mother, at a young age, the mother was encouraging the daughter to be promiscuous. It is also a very strange writing style. You don't really know what's going on. You're really just thrown into it. I won't say a ton more because I do talk about it extensively in my vlog, but this one was a 5-star and this one was a 4-star. So I did love this one, but it took me until the end to love it. To see all of the literary value and merit of this book. So I gave it a 4. This one I loved from the beginning and loved it till the end, so it was a 5-star for me. So for Love in the Time of Cholera, this was a surprise love for me. I gave it a 4 out of 5 just because a 5 out of 5 to me feels sacred in some way, and I feel like this didn't quite go over the edge for me. So our main characters are a pair of ex-lovers. They were involved with each other when they were teenagers. So the woman, Femina, actually rejects Florentino at one point and ends up marrying another man. And so we start the book off with that man dying and then Florentino being like, hey, I'm back. So it was a really interesting start to the book, but over the course of the book, it's a pretty big book. I mean, this is the illustrated edition, but still, it's like a 400-page book. It shows us, as the reader, their entire life story and how both of the characters have this huge change and growth. And by the time they reunite, they are so different, but they can still find some bit of love for each other. So it's a really interesting dynamic. And I really thought that this was going to read a lot more like a classic, because it kind of is a classic. But it was funny in ways that I haven't seen a book be funny in a long time. It had a lot of crude humor and just really ridiculous humor. And I really loved that about it. So this book completely surprised me. I wanted to love it, but going into it, I wasn't sure that I would. And I ended up really, really enjoying it after all. Next, I read Indelicacy by Amina Kane, and I gave this a 5 out of 5. It's about a woman who was poor when she was in her 20s. And she cleaned this museum for a living. And then she ends up marrying a very wealthy man and moving into his mansion. And it's kind of about privilege and where you are in society and how that affects your psyche and who you are as a person, because she's seeing, all these people who were in the spot that she was. She's dealing with the fact that she feels superior even though she was in their shoes at one point. And it's just such an interesting look at how she was able to get out of her poverty and into a better situation, quote unquote. But there's no love in her relationship. And she's kind of having to ask herself, is it worth it for this loveless marriage to be out of poverty? So it's a very interesting look at a lot of different concepts, from how women are treated to, poverty and privilege and all these other things. And it was just such an interesting book. And I actually read it on audio, and then when I went to my local bookshop, I picked it up because the cover is amazing too. Like, she actually uses a museum plate to make the cover, which is just so cool. But yeah, it was such a fascinating read, and I definitely want to give it a reread actually soon and annotate it and fully delve into it again. Next up, I have 2 books that I read for my rereadathon. I also won't go into these in a ton of detail just because I also have a reading blog for that. But they are Birds Art Life by Kyle MacLear and Sourdough by Robin Sloan. So both of these were rereads. Sourdough, I originally gave 4 out of 5 when I read it a while ago, and this time I gave it 5 out of 5 because honestly, I forgot how much fun it is. It's not a read to really make you sit and ponder existence or anything like that. It is a very fun kind of magical realism, urban fantasy kind of book. So this is about Lois, who works in San Francisco on robots, and she's super unhappy. She's not taking care of herself. Right at the beginning of the book, this restaurant opens up and they have the best sourdough bread and the best spicy soup. So she keeps getting stuff from them and she starts to feel better. But her life still isn't perfect. So those brothers who make the soup and the sourdough, they leave. And they leave her a little ceramic crock of sourdough starter. It's about her adventures making sourdough bread, but also all over the place of where sourdough brings her. And that's the part that's like the fantasy element, because a lot of it feels realistic that you could work in this robot company, because there are places like that. And you can make sourdough bread and you can sell it at a farmer's market, but all of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes is definitely magical. So I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 upon reread. As for Birds Art Life by Kyle MacLear, I read this on audiobook at the beginning of 2020 when I was driving to and from college. And it's really just about Kyle MacLear's life and how she was dealing with her father's illness, and she ended up going bird watching to try to clear her head. And it's about all of that, like grief and distraction and all of those things, but it's also about creativity and what inspires her as a writer. It's got really nice illustrations throughout because she also illustrates. So this one was a 5 out of 5, just as it was the first time I read it. Next up, I finally finished rereading A Fault in Our Stars by John Green. I must have talked about this in my January wrap-up because I also read it in January, but I was rereading it yet again to my boyfriend out loud. So we finally finished it, and there's not a lot to say about it other than the fact that I got him to read my favorite book finally, even though I had to read it to him, and surprisingly, he really liked it. I was not expecting him to like it. He wasn't expecting to like it, but he did. So proud girlfriend moment. Next up, I have 2 Wings of Fire books that I read this month, and they are The Poison Jungle and The Dangerous Gift, both by Tui T. Sutherland. And this one just came out this month, so I got my copy and I got a signed book plate with it, so that was really cool. And this one is book 13 and this one is book 14. So I finished this one and then immediately got this one in the mail. I held off reading it for a few days just so that my boyfriend could catch up with reading, but both of these were 5 out of 5s for me. This one I didn't love as much until the end because this character is such an angry character. This character is also angry, but she was fun to read from. This one was just obnoxious, and then at the end, she finally learned some lessons, and both of these end on huge cliffhangers. So this one, it was fine because I had this one, but this one, we're not going to get another book from her for probably like a year and a half. So now we just have to sit with this cliffhanger for a really long time. And I'm not happy about that. So this month, actually, I'm thinking about it. I did so many bookish things this month. So this month I participated in the Women in Horror Readathon that was hosted by Read by Beth. And for that, I ended up reading 2 Shirley Jackson books. I wanted to read more diversely, and I had a horror book that was an Asian translated piece, but I wanted to save that for my translated literature vlogs. So I ended up just reading 2 Shirley Jackson books. The first was The Witchcraft of Salem Village, which I read on audio. It was a very short audiobook. It was like 4 hours. And it was just a story about witchcraft in Salem Village. It wasn't like a true story necessarily, but it was kind of historical fiction in that it took things that really did happen during the trials, the witch trials and all of that, but it just made it into a Shirley Jackson-esque, scary story. So I gave that a 4 out of 5, and I did really enjoy that. But the bigger thing that happened that week when I did that readathon is that I finished The Haunting of Hill House, which I had started in October. Literally in October, and then put aside because I had so much reading to do for school and just never ended up picking it back up. So I got like 80 pages into it in October and then just never finished it. So I ended up finishing it, and I went through and I completely annotated it throughout the entire book. I just added a bunch of little annotations here and there when I was reading, and it was such a fun process. So this is basically about a few people who go to Hill House, which was supposedly haunted. There's this doctor, there's the owner of the house, or the future owner of the house, and then there's Eleanor and Theodora, who are 2 young women who end up at Hill House. And there's not really an exact reason why they're there. They're just there to kind of observe and be part of the doctor's study of the house. And Eleanor, we're kind of over her shoulder perspective-wise, even though it is third person. And so we're getting all of her thoughts as well as the kind of the third person account of what's happening in Hill House. I don't want to say more about the plot because I will spoil it, but honestly, I think that it's a seminal work in the horror genre. I think it's a really important book to read if you're interested in that genre. And the final piece is just absolutely wonderful. So if you're interested in horror, it's really not that scary in contrast to some other things that I've read. I will say that I enjoyed this more for its literary value and merit, and really picking it apart and annotating it and studying it as if I was in class in college. Plot-wise, it is very interesting. Just personally, my enjoyment out of it really came from studying it so in depth. So I would highly recommend this if you're interested in those kind of themes and want to really take a deep dive into studying it. Highly recommend. And then finally, at the recommendation of my coworker and also many different booktubers that I really like, I read Pretty Girls by Karen Slaughter. So this was the craziest book that I read this month, and probably the craziest book that I've read in a long time. It follows 2 sisters who are estranged, and one of the sisters has this rich husband who gets murdered, and it takes both of the sisters down this whole kind of path of figuring out what happened to him, but also what happened to their sister. Years and years ago, they had a third sister who was abducted. It's not a book that I would recommend to everyone, like, you should read this, because it was a lot, and I am okay with a lot of stuff in kind of the horror and thriller field. I've watched a lot of movies like that. I haven't read a ton of thrillers, but I also have watched a ton of thrillers and psychological horror and things like that, so I have a pretty good tolerance for it, and this book made my stomach turn on multiple occasions. So just take that into consideration before picking up this book. It is a lot, and it is very intense. But I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 because I really did enjoy the story and how fast-paced it was, and I got super invested and involved in reading this. So I appreciated that, especially because when I was reading this, I kind of was trying to get out of a little reading slump, because when I was trying to do my translated literature vlog, I was reading another book that I ended up DNFing, and was just really unhappy with it. So once I put that aside and started reading this, I kind of got out of that, because it is so interesting and crazy, and you just want to find out what's happening. It played on some tropes that I'm not 100% a fan of. So spoiler alert, if you don't want to know, don't watch this next part. But someone comes back from the dead, quote unquote, and is like, hey, I faked my death, I'm here. Which is just a trope that I'm not a huge fan of. So that was my main criticism. The only other thing that held me back from giving it 5 stars was just that it was so gross and disgusting and morbid and terrible. And the images in this book was just, it was so much that I couldn't in good conscience give it a 5 out of 5 because yes, I enjoyed it, but it was also so horrible that I don't know, something about it, I just couldn't give it a 5 out of 5. So that's that. So these are all the books let's see. There we go. These are all the books that I read in March. It was tons of books. I hope that when I was discussing these, I was somewhat concise. It's so hard for me to formulate things to say about books, even if I really loved them. Sometimes that's even harder. It's like, how do you explain why you loved something? I don't know. I just loved it. But I had a really good reading month. A lot of these were just amazing books. All of them were amazing books. Lots of 5 out of 5s. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you've read any of these, I'd love to know what you think of them in the comments. So if you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you next time. Bye.